Alright, you primitive screwheads, listen up. Welcome back to Dark Arts and Entertainment, Grimm's Tales of Japan. I am your host, Eric the Brother Grimm Drummond, and today we are sticking around Japan for something very, not just my normal breed of spooky, but also something pretty poignant, pretty serious. And of course, today I'm going to hit on the very famous topic of the Aokigahara Forest, or also known as the Suicide Forest, as well as some other aspects of suicide here in Japan that fit our mold that maybe you haven't heard of just yet, but you will today. Now, when it comes to the Aokigahara, first of all, anybody who's ever done any kind of research on the paranormal in Japan, if you do any kind of Googling for haunted Japan, this is going to be one of the first things that always comes up. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that right out of the gate, I am unimpressed by it as far as paranormal is concerned. I actually don't think that there's very much to it. But, of course, it is a serious subject, and there is plenty of regular, normal associated with the suicide forest that does tie into the paranormal in some ways. So first off, if you're not familiar with it, I'm not going to give you an entire history lesson on it, but I do want to catch people up. The Aokigahara, also known as the Suicide Forest, is the forest that surrounds Mount Fuji. It's a large place. It's out where Fuji is a fairly rural area here in Japan. It's not a city. It's not like the big cities of Tokyo or Nagoya or Osaka. It's a popular tourist attraction, of course, because people climb Mount Fuji all the time. And it's also a hub for transportation traveling to and from Japan. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. So people visit this spot constantly, moving in and out. And the Aokigahara Forest surrounding Mount Fuji is no exception. So, like I mentioned, it's a very large forest and it has some unique traits to it. The first off is that this forest is year-round, always green. The nickname of the forest, translated from Japanese, is the Sea of Trees, because it looks like an ocean. It's a green, lush, rolling forest scape. And it stays that way, even though they get snow, they get winter, they get all of that. Plenty of it's a temperate area, so they get plenty of it. This forest stays its wonderful shade of green that you can see from a distance. But when you get into the forest, that's when things take a little bit of a different turn. It's still very green, but now you understand why, due to some of its environmental conditions, including about 1,000 years ago, Mount Fuji erupted and covered its surrounding area with lava, very sharp, very porous lava rocks. But since all the other environmental conditions are so conducive to life, over the years, a forest grew on top of all the lava rocks. And that's what the reason behind its very odd shape. When you go through the forest, number one, it's really, really thick and confusing and overgrown. The vegetation that's in it is mostly trees and inedible shrubbery, inedible vegetation. Well, there's not a whole lot of other life in the forest. Something that people who I know who have been to the forest have remarked on the conspicuous absence of sound. Forest creatures, birds, nothing. I mean, it's a very, very silent and still place. When people go to the forest, you can walk around through trails, just like any other national park. You can even go camping there if you want. The warning signs are when the forest rangers, environmental specialists that patrol the area and study the area, they go to the parking lots and they see cars, and they see the same car that has been sitting there for days or even weeks on end. And that's a telltale sign that people have been using this forest for its most famous purpose, and that is to walk into and never come out of. People go to the forest for suicide, and hence the name the Suicide Forest. They go there as a popular spot to commit suicide. Back in the old days of Japan, it was a very normal practice that during times of famine and drought, when you had too many mouths to feed and not enough rice to fill them with, the weak, the infirm, and most especially the elderly were taken to the forest and abandoned, thereby giving one less mouth to feed. Suicide as we know it today, as an escape from life's difficulties, was actually a pretty new phenomenon, particularly here in Japan. It just wasn't done. Now, suicide in general, associated with Japan, of course, people think of seppuku or harikari. But that was suicide for a purpose. It's more like jumping in front of a bullet to save someone else. There was a singular purpose in mind for the sacrifice involved with suicide. These days, however, continuing the tradition of taking people who needed to die so that others can live up into the forest has continued. It was way back, probably the 1950s or 60s, when this became a popular thing again in the Aokigahara and the area surrounding it. What would happen is people would go to the forest and they would wander into it, hearing stories of people who wandered into the forest and never came out, mostly because, like I mentioned, the forest is big, it's confusing, and it's really, really strange in its terrain. All of these things make it extremely easy to get lost. The lack of edible vegetation, the lack of any kind of hunting or trapping options for survival purposes means dying of exposure could be a very real possibility, and it has been in this forest. So people would keep that up. The young in particular, but believe me, this is not age discriminatory, would wander into the forest, and the most popular way to deal with their problems was by hanging. To this day, you can walk into the forest, and there's many roped off areas that clearly state, do not go beyond this point. It's very confusing. You can get lost easily beyond this point. And there are also signs posted everywhere in Japanese, and only Japanese, which is interesting for this country, telling people to not commit suicide, giving them reasons to not commit suicide. Think of your family, think of your friends, think of your children. Even a suicide hotline number is posted on these signs throughout the forest. But if you do wander past them, because they're not guarded, and it's a forest, and you're basically just walking in the woods, people would walk in most commonly with ropes or plastic bags. To this day, what was it? Last reports, over 100 people have been found dead in the suicide forest by hanging just within the last 20 years. More have been found. The second most common way to kill yourself in the forest is pills, which is largely unsuccessful. It's not unique to Japan. Most people who try it with pills end up failing. The problem is that it leaves you in a very weakened state, a very sick state, and you're out in the middle of the forest, alone, unsheltered, and hungry and thirsty. The bodies that were found that were not hanged are normally found died of thirst, exposure, starvation, with a lot of pills in their system, but the pills themselves didn't do it. If you go to the forest today, you can wander off the beaten path if you desire. Don't be surprised to see tape, like construction tape, hung all over the place. People use that construction tape as a trail of breadcrumbs to try and find their way back through the forest. Usually it's also a sign that somebody who has wandered into the forest for the purpose of suicide leaves a trail back to their campsite because they have not fully committed themselves to the idea. and they want to find their way back. If you find tape, if you follow it, be prepared. You could find some grisly remains on the other side. Normally, when the rangers go through the forest and they find the tape, they will take care of whatever it is that they find. And if they find nothing, or if they find whatever it is that they were unfortunately looking for, a corpse, a skeleton, even a person still alive needing help, they will take care of it and they will clean everything else up. So if you do find something, it's new. So be ready for that. Now, as far as hauntings go, it's pretty well theorized that suicides don't move on. Sacrifices do, but suicides don't. And the difference between the two is the impetus behind why they're taking their life. Suicides tend to take their lives because they feel lost in it. And when you're lost in life, there's nothing saying that death is going to change that. Because of this, suicides tend to stick around. Now, this forest, being seemingly teeming with macro life, is conspicuously devoid of the micro. Very little living things are there other than the trees and the vegetation. Because of this, it has a very somber air to it. The whole place, when you're walking around, it's not like a regular forest. I love hiking and I love walking around forests. And very often, you get that feeling of, connecting with the living, breathing air and all the earth that's around you. In this forest, it just feels forlorn. Because of that, the suicides certainly don't help. Now, there haven't been very good documentation of hauntings in this forest. That's one of the reasons I'm actually not so thrilled about it, not so convinced. When the suicides leave their body in this forest, they don't tend to be active. They tend to be absorbed into it and add to that air of hopelessness, that air of despair that people breathe in when they walk around it. So until I see some better evidence, some better documentation, all I have right now are anecdotal stories, and even the stories that people tell who have visited the forest don't tend to be all that good. Now, while the suicide forest is popular, at least in lore and urban legends, the actual spookiest stuff involving this can be found on the little island archipelago of Okinawa. We will visit Okinawa again later on this podcast because it is a virtual smorgasbord of paranormal activity and spooky stories. In this case, what I'm going to bring up is what's called the Suicide Cliffs. In World War II, terrified of the prospect of surrender, many military people and civilians both decided to check themselves out rather than get caught up in the fighting and the aftermath of the fighting in the Second World War. So they would literally fling themselves off the cliffs and into the ocean and rocks below them all over the islands. Now, I mean, if you've ever been to Okinawa, one of the things that always protected Japan during its period of isolation is its geography. Okinawa is no different. There's very few landing points. The surrounding waters are very difficult to get a ship into, and its natural geography has always protected it, helping keep its isolation. The surrounding areas around these islands are shallow. There's usually very sheer rocky cliffs, and the ocean tides are very violent. People all over the islands would find the tallest cliff that they could find and just fling themselves off of it, rather than succumb to the problems associated with war. They were convinced that it was the honorable thing to do, thereby Some of the generals would gather people up and convince them with long and well-made speeches about what they ought to do rather than succumb to the enemy. Now, whereas this happened all over the islands, it was the area called Itoman that has the strongest reputation. Ghost jumpers are the modern day tales that you're going to hear about this area. You can go to the cliffs and occasionally see white shapes flinging themselves from the cliffs into the rock below. If you climb the cliffs yourself and actually dare to look down to the rocks below, people have said that they have seen faces in the waves that crash against the rocks looking back up at them. And we all know how it ended. But one of the things that sets Okinawa apart from Japan is their real strict emphasis on graves. In Japan, ceremonial burial and care of the graves are essential. In Okinawa, they are essential too. Yet when the neglect happens, more activity tends to be reported. And there was no care for any kind of graves that happened in these mass jumpings. Have a good second look at Okinawa. Believe me, I've got more stories about those islands, and we're going to be telling them later on in these podcasts. But if you take anything away from this, it's understanding the implications of suicide. Realize that for all intents and purposes, they don't tend to move on. Certainly, they don't tend to move on well. I've experienced that in my own life, as I'm sure many of you have also. So I don't think I need to emphasize the importance of finding help if and when you should find it, to keep you or anybody that you know from being just another number and just another story. Next time, we're going to come back to maybe a little bit less heavy of a topic, but this had to be said. I hope that you took something away from this. And as always, if you have stories, I want to hear them. Contact me anytime through any of the channels that you're listening to this on. Catch up with me on Facebook. And remember, some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some are meant to be savored. Thank you again for listening. Grim out.